let's have Hans with us, who's going to tell us how we should be teaching electronic music. I'm going to take notes.
Okay, you're taking away my first line, actually, saying I'm certainly not here to tell you how you should teach electronic music. But I will hopefully contribute with some thoughts and some observations I had the chance to make throughout those 25 years. I mean, 25 years of having an academic position. I've been starting teaching earlier, but being in that role. So very often when we think about teaching with technology, there seems to be two strands, either these kind of music tech programs where we look only at tools, only at software and programming, and then hope that the student will figure out what to do musically, or we have the composition programs where we talk about material and thoughts and philosophy and form and all of this. So we also touch on the why question, and then we hope that this somehow trickles into something becoming an independent creative thinker. Now, I don't think, or in my own practice, I've never seen this kind of division into these two clear-cut fields. If I'm just thinking about my own practice where we are recording sounds, either with musicians in the studio or soundscapes outdoors or with sound objects, as I will show later, and then we go through some kind of a selection and cleaning process, and we make already kind of first categories of what kind of material we want to use, etc., and not. Sometimes we go into more kind of a programming area where we process sounds, we probably synthesize things, we start making these building blocks in a DAW, in Pro Tools, Reaper, whatever it is. We might develop specific tools in Super Collider Max or other languages. We might think about multi-channel distribution of sounds. So I'm more on the left side right now where I'm talking about the technology of things, but obviously we don't do this without thinking about what I'm actually composing. Is it a piece which is site-specific in a particular gallery with a particular architecture, or is it just a general concert piece? Or is it in conjunction with other art forms, dance, film, music, theater, etc.? So all of these fields, and there are certainly many more, they are interconnected, and we constantly navigate from one to another. A certain technological decision influences the concept, and a certain concept idea will ask for a certain technical innovation. In our teaching, hopefully, all of these things somehow are part of what we want to convey or what we want to discuss. And I can only stress also that the lower right corner is really important. How do we teach to rehearse? Because rehearsals are very often just left to, okay, so yeah, you have to get it up, and then hopefully we are ready when the door opens. So, as Dirk already mentioned, we need a technical infrastructure. And I guess if you think about institutions and that we are fighting for budgets and we try to have a nice infrastructure, and then we build these studios, we also have to stress that these are these kind of spaces for social exchange, spaces for exchange of ideas, where you can just knock on someone else's door and say, oh, what are you doing, etc. And that is an important role, not only for the educational studios, but also for the production studios. I guess also to convince students that there is something else than listening to a Bluetooth earbud sound, which is kind of compressed anyhow, and doing everything on your laptop. So use a good speaker system. They're set up for you. They're set up in an acoustical environment. So at Harvard, we had electronic music since the late 60s. It has undergone a lot of different change. When I joined the faculty in 2004, the studios looked like on the right side of the picture. Not necessarily studios. I mean, there were classrooms where they set up some computers and some speakers. And back then, the situation was certainly better than today, and we were able actually to totally redo the studios and turn them into acoustically treated and well-equipped workstations. And then what I just said before, to convince the students to use them, that was not a problem back then. That has turned into something probably over the last 5-6 years, where the availability of all these software tools in your laptop suggests that you can do this music just anywhere in your living room. We also set up a 40-channel loudspeaker system to perform this music, which was probably one of the first in the US back then, because electronic music coming out of the Princeton studios, etc., most of the time was just something where you set up 2 or at max 4 speakers in a room. So spatial sound, like we know from an acousmonium or so, that was not a practice. I guess a lot, or many of my colleagues face a similar question or a similar problem. How do we teach all these different topics when we are a very small department? So I'm the only one teaching electronic music in our school. So how do I cover all of those things? Now I can think about certain courses I'm offering on a constant basis and others which are offered whenever I have the time for it or whenever I sense that there is a certain interest in a group of students, etc. But not all of those topics are possibly taught at any given moment. So there might be students coming through our program for 4 years and they have not ever touched on a particular topic. It's just physically not possible. Now we can enlarge that, or we can hope to bridge this by collaborations across the different schools. So we have done a lot of collaborations with the dance department, with the visual department, with other improvising musicians, just to bring art forms into our room, into the classroom, but also on the stage, which are not possible just within our small department. We have collaborated also with some other universities, Northeastern particularly, because they have a really nice concert hall. It looks like a church. It used to be a church, but it's acoustically extremely well treated, no long reverb, very clear sound. And it is also a very mobile space, so you can set up things in a very liberate way. And then also it was very nice. We put up a festival together with the Goethe Institute in 2011. It was also very nice to draw in their students and actually have then collaborations between our students and their students. And then the last resort, I guess, everybody is doing is inviting people who have something to say in this field and bring them in for workshops, bring them in for concerts, and have the students kind of shadow them while they rehearse. I think that's another thing I said earlier. We have to teach also how to rehearse. I always encourage students to be present during rehearsals. That's the space where I learned a lot, because there you see where things are not perfectly flowing, and then you can ask your questions. Why is it? What was the lag in the preparation, or what was the things you thought would work, but suddenly in a room with a different technology don't work, or the sound doesn't work? So all these things, they're only actually discovered when we put the work into the space with the diffusion system at hand. In my course on live electronics, I will just briefly mention them here, and then I will spend the longer time of my talk about a course to introduce students to electronic music. In the live electronics course, I'm looking a lot into the relationship to the instrument. So how do we make actually something an instrument? And in joking, it's now a joke I'm known for, but I'm still repeating it. I always say nobody would pick up today the clarinet if we fear in 6 months is an update and the keys are at a different position. So we need somehow stability, or we need at least the illusion of a stability in order to invest. And we all know, or those who have learned an instrument, we know we need to invest those 10,000 hours to make that instrument somehow part of us, to breathe with it, to have it, and to have this instant access. So these are just 3 images from my own electronic setup from the mid-'80s, and then over the past 20 years, or almost 25 years now, the setup has not changed. I have 2 keyboards, I have a couple of pedals, and I have 2 computers. Obviously, those keyboards and the pedals and the computers have changed, but the reference is the same. And I compare that very often to an organ. You go from one church organ to another. I mean, the layout is slightly different, but the main functionality and your reflexes, they stay the same. And if you think about Michael Weisfisch with his hands, I mean, he built this instrument, he played it for a long time. He changed the sounds, but the physical relationship to the position and what these different sensors on the hands were doing, that remained the same. And that brings me to an observation I like for my own work, is thinking about embodied experiences. So my first synthesizer was in '82, the Synthi A. And that was a very nice module because you had all these pins where you can make these free interconnections. And when I then first started implementing ideas like this in Max MSP, which became the monster, I cast it pretty much after the model of the SynthDA. So having modules within outs and having a matrix to interconnect them. So they have this free flow of, oh, this is now a control and now it's an audio and then now it's in control again. Or having not this pre-wired succession of source and filter and envelope and then some other processes. I want to talk for a few minutes about how I think about the creative process and some observations I made also on my own work and probably also in teaching. So if you just try to formalize, if that's possible at all, what we do when we try to do something creative. So let's say I want to write a poem. I'm taking a pen, I have a piece of paper, I have an idea, and I'm writing it down. So I'm starting from an imagination, I'm going through the process of writing, the realization, and I'm getting to a result. I can read what I just wrote. And that result will trigger a reflection. And most of the time, I'm not happy with the result. Otherwise, art making would be too easy. So we go into this iterative loop where the reflection on the current result points to the idea and points to the realization. Things become more complicated when we have a computer or any technology in between, because there's an added step. There's a step of formalization. So I have an idea, now I have to make a max patch. So how do I break my idea, which is still in my head kind of full-formed language, into something the computer understands? So I have to break it up, I have to program it, and then I'm using that tool, that patch, to realize it. And the result, again, probably not in the first round, will not be satisfactory, and I'll say, okay, so what is wrong? Is it the idea, is it the formalization, or the realization? In some instances, it becomes a little bit tricky to make the difference between the formalization and the realization, but in most cases, you can actually analyze it fairly well. Now, what I observe, and that's the point I made in the slides, is most of the time what happens then is this. With technology, once the idea was born, we are getting so caught up in figuring out it is not nice because, oh, was there a bug in the thing, or should I use another plugin, or should I play it differently? And we somehow leave the idea out of the equation. We're getting so busy with the technology that we don't question, was it actually a good thing to start with? So getting back to our ideas and getting back to where we can see the entire process as an integration and a use of technology, but not us as a slave of technology because we once started the power button. I will now talk in a little bit more detail about a course I have started when I first came to Harvard, which is probably very different from teaching in Europe. I had taught at conservatories here, and the big difference is the concept of the liberal arts college. So you see students essentially for 3 months. They take one course, and they can come from any discipline. They are not necessarily music concentrators or music majors. They major in anything else because the parents want them to make some money later. But they're all good trained musicians. But there is no follow-up course. So you have to give them what you have in 3 months. So what I'm describing here is this course where I hope to first incite some interest in making their own sounds. Particularly now, they have all these kind of 100,000 plugins in their computer, and they always think, oh yeah, I can record this sound and just banging this thing, and then I can run it through my plugins and it will be wonderful. I've tried to invert that and say, no, you have to start with your own sounds. And we look into all kinds of objects and possibilities to play them. And I try to convey, let's say, I'm picking here 3 examples, to convey kind of musical knowledge we all have already acquired by learning music through the process of recording. So we all know that a violin is not just a string, but it has actually a body attached to it, and that contributes to the resonance that makes the sound what the violin sound is. So let's figure out what we can do when we attach certain sound makers to other resonators and then we mic the resonator. So here's a sequence. This is actually taken from sound recordings I made for a piece I will premiere here on Saturday called Spaces High Pressure. So all sounds for that piece were recorded on that frame drum, asserting or exerting some pressure on it. But here it's actually taken as an example of this coupling of some playing and the resonator. We talk a lot theme and variation. That is not something someone has invented at their desk in the 17th century. It's something where that models pretty much how our perceptive apparatus works. We constantly, with our senses, look into the world, taste into the world, feel into the world to take in all this stimuli and then try to compare them against models we already know. And in music particularly, theme and variation is a good model which has worked for a lot of composers. So we establish something which becomes a known entity and then we start to vary it. So if I extrapolate that into the sound making, let's make a theme. Let's make one sound gesture and then repeat it a couple of times. It becomes clear that it's impossible to play that exactly the same twice because it's such a complex object. But what the beauty is then, if I record a certain number of those, I have many variations. Some of them might be better, others are not so good. And then when I need another copy of them in my piece, I will certainly not take the one we just heard before. That is also the big difficulty with all these loops where we get the exact repetition of the same sound over and over and over and over again. If you ask a musician to play something twice, well, there might be slight variations and they seem to contribute to what we just heard about the dehumanization or humanization of things. So having more than one copy of a sound is a nice feature. But also in my multi-channel works, if I want to have that now demultiplied into space, I just take 8 of those copies, put them into 16 speakers, and I have that same overall gesture with all those variations happening at the same time. So I'm getting actually something which goes also in questions of spatialization. And the last one we are talking a lot about is, okay, so if I have the idea of having, let's say, 3 different sonic events going on, and I record them individually and then I put them into my DAW and I mix them together. What is the difference of trying to perform them at the same time? So what I'm putting up here, we have this cardboard box and I glued a little brush to it and then I'm bowing the cardboard with the double bass bow. And what you can clearly observe, every time I'm trying to make this sound with a double bass bow, I apparently slow down the movement of the box on the skin. So there is then also a gestural connection between the 3, which would be very hard to simulate if they are actually just separately recorded and then mounted together as sounds. So after exploring sounds. Obviously, we need, when we do this, always understand, I mean, I can't talk about all of this, as the microphone as an instrument. The microphone is not this neutral object just to record your piano, but it is actually an active member of the sound-making chain. Listening through headphones, all of this is part of it. So after that, we start a musical idea, and I'm very precise about it, and say, okay, your musical flow should last for 30 seconds. So make some musical idea for 30 seconds. That's something we can easily hold in our brain. And what I'm talking about a lot about is this kind of model. We develop a model. If someone plays Chopin, that interpreter has developed some mental model that can come from the score, it could come from the recording of another player he likes. It could also come, and it certainly comes from just practicing the piece, and while you're not happy with something, well, you do it again. And while you do something, sometimes it's also the body driving the music and saying, oh wow, that was actually a nice idea. I didn't think I would do that, but that's actually something I could go after. So also the doing is enriching our model. So there's this kind of two-way of imagination and realization back and forth. So I asked them to use a stopwatch to make these 30-second recordings really precise and develop some musical directionality, not to make them static, and record a few versions of them. And then after they recorded a few versions of that same musical idea, listen to them on the computer or on just with the headphones. So listening to them without being in the action of doing them, that is giving us kind of different feedback, and then thinking about it and re-recording. So here's an example of one of those 30-second sequences. It's not a great example, but just to give you kind of an idea of what we are talking about. The next step I will talk about is what I call for my students the mystery factor. So if you would just now imagine that you had heard that sequence and would have liked to know how that was made, you would have had all kinds of imaginations of what that could have been. And I think that is it's a good added quality to the sequence. If we immediately can make the connection to what it was, then our brain trying to figure out that model can immediately tick off, oh yeah, that was a coin spinning on the table, or that was a ping pong ball falling on the floor. And then we are not listening so attentive anymore. So I'm encouraging them to make sounds which go beyond the easy rendering of a musical idea. So I'll just show you 4 examples from this term, just from the first weeks of this semester. So I give them one first element. I give them, okay, make something which sounds like a rotation for 30 seconds. And we're talking about don't take the visual world. I mean, right now we have certainly a rotating ventilator in this projector here that rotates, but it doesn't produce a sound of rotation. It just makes G. So you need to make a sound which sounds like a rotation. And then typically we get something like calyps, so the upper left one, which sounds like this. He's already quite inventive because he tries also to shape the sounds. You get these smaller impacts at the high frequency area, etc. And he plays with this left-right movement to enhance the image of the rotation. We get examples like Isabel's, where she establishes the image of the rotation very quickly in the beginning and then slows down the movement to actually listen more into the qualities of each repetition of the revolving object. And then after that first week, and we listen to them and we give critique, I say, okay, so now try to do the same rotation but with very different material, or where it is not so obvious anymore. And then we get something more mystery factor like Harry's. And then certainly my critique is, but that doesn't sound like a rotation anymore. Then we get something like Marley's. So by just observing a very familiar phenomenon, everybody is, familiar with, we can actually go into quite a lot of detail talking about sounds, our impressions, what we hear, what we don't hear, quality of recording, if they bump into the microphone in the middle of it, no, that's wrong, and that's like a wrong note in your scale. So to get the technology right, to get the process right, but also to say something with it, to have an artistic intent with it. After that, we start then taking that into the DAW and then cut it up. So the week after that one we just saw, okay, make a new sequence. You take your 30-second recorded sequence and you cut it up. The only things which are allowed is cutting, splicing, reversing short moments, and crossfading. And that is the thing for 6 weeks. They are not allowed to use any effects. No effects, no plugins, no reverb. Everything has to be done just by learning how to edit the sounds themselves. From there, we then make a two-voice counterpoint. So you make a sequence from one material, and then you make a sequence for a second material, and then you put them together. And obviously, if they're composed independently, they're not this counterpoint, they're just kind of two sounds happening at the same time, and then learning what do you need to make, what do you have to take out or change in either of them, that they become really something, a dialogue, a code-dependent musical flow of two voices where the one doesn't make much sense without the other one. So here I'm giving kind of the rundown of the entire semester. So we are now kind of here, the counterpoint. From there we make out of that counterpoint a part A, and then the week later we make a part B. It should be of different materials, a different musical probably flow or energy profile. So after about 6 weeks we have a two-part composition. And then I'm asking them to write a sound story, because then it's really kind of the time to work towards the final project. So something they're really interested in. It needs to be a personal story, something they want to tell in sound. And I always say, when you write the story, make it into one page, and describe more what sounds, not so much how things look. We are so visually in describing how things look. No, try to describe what the sonic world is. And then they have to compose that within 3 weeks. I just say, okay, you divide the workload into 3 chunks. It's not important that they become later 3 formal parts of the composition. It's just you have to cut up your workload into 3 sections, and your week 1 you compose, we give feedback, but you don't touch it. Compose part 2, compose part 3, and only after we have kind of a first draft of it, then I say, okay, now you can probably even go away from your story. Your story was the starting point. We don't need it anymore. You have composed enough music to make some sense out of it. And then we go into, obviously we have still a little bit of time to refine it, then make graphical scores, talking about sound diffusion. So we set up our diffusion system in the studio where we have 16 channels, so that they get actually the first sense of, okay, I'm opening a fader and that makes that sound come out of that speaker. So to learn that kind of diffusion idea, and then after 12 weeks we go into the concert hall, set up the system, and they perform. So it is really a crash course, but I give you 2 more examples where I'm always amazed how well that actually works, because first of all, the advantage is they have no cultural baggage in this music at all. I mean, nobody has heard about musique concrète or whatever before. And I'm just saying, okay, so you think whatever music you think, you just take out your beat. And that's for 12 weeks, listen just to the sounds. And then afterwards you put your beat back. That's totally fine, but it will be different. I'm combining that with listening to the repertoire, because that's for sure they have never heard about. So I give them pieces to listen to, and I ask them to write half a page. And that half a page, and the list on the left side obviously is much longer than this screen could fit, but this is pieces I've been using, or composers I've been using pieces from. So the first week is just write whatever. I don't care. Just write half a page, and then midweek they have to send that back. I compile it into one long document and send it back to everybody. So everybody has to read everybody's comments. And then the question almost always in the beginning of the class is then, okay, so did you discover anything in someone else's writing you didn't think about, or you don't agree with, etc. So just to see that there are probably many ways of talking about this music and thinking about it. And obviously the first week, most of the answers is, oh yeah, this reminds me 1950s sci-fi movie track or something. And then walking from these comparisons away and saying, okay, that's fine, that's your memory. We can also talk on a different level. We can probably also say, oh, instead of saying this sounds like a car door slamming, then I say, okay, which car? Was it in a garage or was it outdoors? So all these kind of images we can easily use, which are very meaningful because they just describe a personal memory, but that is a personal memory which is not shareable. So going into describing the sound, no, it has a low frequency impact. There seems to be a little bit of reverb, and then, but at the same time, there's also this high screeching sound for a very brief moment. So that gives us something we can all share, we can talk about. So going from these personal memories away and then talking about memory elements we rediscover in the piece. So how is actually a certain sound used as theme and variation, or as something which comes back, which structures time. And from there, slowly going into how do we perceive form? Is there any relationship between material and form, temporal flow, etc.? In closing, I just want to give you one example from this term. So this is a story. That is something they don't know, but I'm never reading those stories. Because I don't want to be influenced. When I listen to their weekly progress, I just want to listen what I hear, not saying, oh yeah, this must be this in this story and this. So I read the stories for a few years, and then I thought, no, I should stop this. This is not helpful. And then at some point I reveal it also that I'm not reading their stories. They're always disappointed. But I say, this is your crutch, this is your way of not being afraid of your blank page and getting to go and start something. So the process I'm getting them into it is they have to write the story, and then for years we did this on paper, and then everybody gets everybody's stories and makes on the right side a little bit annotations. You could do this, you could do that. Nowadays it's a Google sheet. And then they make a first round of what I call the Polaroids. So you just grab a few ideas from all these suggestions and make a short 20-second rendering of it. That's an important step to experiment with something which is outside of the composition still. So not saying, oh yeah, I have to get this right because otherwise I don't make my 5 minutes, etc. Just explore. So make these kind of things quick, dirty, just a rendering of an idea. And then we get into this composition process. So what we will hear now, this is from this Monday, so just 3 days ago, from Eloy, one of the students who 7 weeks ago, roughly, 7 weeks ago, didn't know that this music exists, wrote a story, and this is the first rendering of his first third. So he didn't get any critique on it, and that is typical. I mean, it's not outstanding, but it's pretty typical of what a student could do after these couple of weeks. wherever the first third is shorter than the other thirds. That's typical, because they have to get going, and then, I mean, it's just the proportions don't play so much a role. We also don't talk about length then, because we say we can't judge now. You know, we need to hear what the second and third portion of your piece will actually provide, and then we can talk proportions. So I like this John Cage quote, and I guess your quote is very similar to, okay, the technology was kind of consumed in the music, and here Cage says when the technology disappears, it's probably at its highest point. So how do we make this technology disappear? Or probably disappearing is not a good way to think of it for my sense, but how do we make it as integrated as possible? So just to summarize here a few of my key points, I'm trying to teach as little technology as necessary. So we're always looking just into the technology they need for next week. And I always tell them, you know, of this program I probably use, and I probably only know 15%, and all the other stuff was never necessary. And if it becomes necessary one day, then I will learn it. I try to guide them to find their own sounds, because I think that when we make music which should distinguish itself from someone else, then it needs to be personal. And that is not just the ideas. For me, it starts with the sounds. I'm trying to convey that Embodied Experiences can give us a lot of good ideas and good incentives to work with technology. And I'm imposing very strong limits. And that comes just from this, whoever started with gear which had 5 modules in there, and you couldn't go and just download another one. Well, you had those 5 modules and you had to compose with it. And you knew them very well, and you invented a lot of creative stuff just with those limitations. So I always felt that creative limitations are not just terrible, they are also a blessing, because you have to really go deep. So I'm posing these creative limits and then gradually lift them. So this one student, this is a running joke this semester, he always asked me, can I use this? No. Can I now use this? No. And then last week I told him, now you can use this plugin. Okay. Confronting students with a wide range of aesthetic ideas, it's important. At some point in this listening sequence, I also, one week I asked them, so next week, you bring a piece of music you love. Not just like, and not just because a friend of you likes it. No, you need to love it. And you need to know why you love it. It can be anything. It can be electronic dance music, it can be rap, it can be a string quartet, it can be a Beatles song. Style, epoch doesn't make any difference. You need to love it. And then we share that, and everybody has listened to everybody's. And then everybody in the room is asked to ask questions to the person who proposed the piece. And then they reveal why they love it. And they say, don't make it a person's story, not because it reminds you of your grandmother. That's something we can't share. You need to look into the music. What's in the music, and why do you love it in the music? And then the last thing I asked them, okay, imagine space restrictions all not present. Make a concert program of it. Put these pieces into a concert order. So they have to think about contrast, about how things play off, also how the memory within the concert program works, etc. I'm only introducing my own work pretty late in this semester, particularly not to, they are all beginners, so not to show them this is the way to do stuff. And when I'm presenting my work, most of the time I'm talking more about my questions and the moments when things did not work as I intended. Because it's not because you have done that for a long time that you exactly know how everything works and how you compose. So you're in front of this white page every time anew, and just showing them that's just how composition or any creative process is makes them probably feel not as inhibited of being a beginner. So I think that is a few points I observed over the years, and I'm happy to discuss more.
Thank you, Hans. Questions? Observations? Paula?
First of all, thank you for this incredibly exciting and convincing description of teaching. Do you touch the question of notation other than with words like the sound story? Because that is a question I often have as I am an instrumental player and teaching instrumental contemporary music. When we see the scores by, let's say, Nono or so, and you have a line for the electronics, it is really simple and often doesn't correspond at all to the complexity of what you hear then.
Mm-hmm.
And is that a thing as well, or what do you say about this? Does somebody else need to be able to read somebody else than the composer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not part of this particular course, but certainly it comes up in my teaching. We have to think about what the purpose of notation is. Historically, the purpose of notation was to reproduce those sounds knowing the conventions. So if there's a little trill in there, I know what to do. If there's a P with a crescendo going to an F, we know what it... It's not that the syntax of the notation is revealing all those details. The syntax of the notation only makes sense in the background of the cultural history we all carry. Now, when we talk about electronic music notation, the purpose is a different one. The purpose is not anymore to reproduce this music. The purpose is to have references in time and know what more or less happens in order to synchronize it. If we don't take Stockhausen's Realisationspartitur von Kontakte, even with this detail, it is actually impossible to reproduce the piece. Because there is knowledge and there are thoughts and processes which happened in the studio you can't notate. So the notation for electronic music, particularly for mixed music, is to give the musician somehow a hint of where it goes. Now, we just saw this Babbitt excerpt in Dirk Wright's presentation. Later on, he wrote this piece, Philomea, for soprano and tape, where the soprano has then to learn this very complex musical tape to sing to it. And the tape is actually notated in normal staff notation. I mean, the most important sounds, etc. So you could play that also in piano. There is also a piano version. What was interesting in that time that the technology and the precision Babbitt had with this machine drove him into an instrumental writing he would not have done otherwise. So there's also this back and forth. But the notation is simple because it is a music which is based on the idea of events, like a note having a certain pitch and a duration. The colors change, but once you understand more or less what they are, you can still follow along the score. Now, if you take any of the Steve Reich pieces and you would try to notate it, it becomes very complicated after a while when you get all these layers kind of dephasing against each other. There's no way of notating that anymore. So what you do is this big black line. And then hopefully when another event happens, then you put some graphical marker. There is no convention, there's no good practice. Some scores work better than others. Oh, we can actually, because that goes probably beyond of what I was talking about. We can have a chat in the break.
Yes, thank you so much for this convincing lecture and that you emphasize on the ideas of the students rather than the gear, which is the right order in my point of view. And I'm curious about your experience when it comes to group dynamics of taste, because you've been in the classroom for that long. And even though you encourage personal approach and personal development for each composer, how do you experience how the group moving through the years and forming each other? Because what we normally see is that the group of students also affect each other very much. So you have a more uniform way of creating music among student groups, even though they differ from you. That's a, can you tell me a little bit
Yeah.
how you look at that?
Obviously, taste and ideas change over the years, and that's also the beauty of teaching. We learn a lot. I mean, just observing what they're busy with right now and thinking, oh, I would not have considered this interesting a few years later, but I have to look into it. Now, my model, my first speech in the beginning of the semester is always, okay, think about anything we talk about in this community or in life in general as a multidimensional object. So we are in this room, I'm holding up this bottle like this. Everybody looks at this object from a different angle, and everybody is able to see it through his, her upbringing, expectations, cultural background, etc. There is no right and wrong. What we can do together is by sharing our opinions on the object to learn to, in our mind, to turn it around and see it from your angle and probably learn something different from it. And what I'm doing in the classroom is I pair them up. Every week, in the beginning of the term, I make all possible combinations between them, and then sometimes we reach them, sometimes not, depends on enrollment. And then every time they have a different partner every week to work with. So they have to do these homeworks alone, but before we go into the class and listen to them, they share it with their partner already once for feedback. So throughout the term also they have this kind of, okay, I'm coming from this type of music, but I'm playing the violin, I'm playing the guitar, etc. So it's very interesting. Also this week when they share the music they love, I mean, we had pretty much a wide range of stuff. And just to see then in the classroom that this is something he loves, I would not even consider this music. So why is that? And then going over these kind of very easy judgments of this is music, this is not music, or this is worth pursuing or not, just because there's the conviction of someone telling you this is really important to me for this reason, that you open your eyes, you open your ears and say, oh, interesting, I didn't think about it. And what we then try to distill is, okay, so if we now listen to everybody's descriptions of what was musically important in the piece of music they heard, well, we can actually bring them down to a very short list of common things. One hears this in EDM, another one hears it in in Gregorian chant, and someone else hears it in a Beatles song. So there is something where we can make some connections to, okay, all the time the same is not interesting, all the time something new is not interesting, finding the perfect needle in between is not possible, so we have to modulate. How do we modulate between introducing something new to going to something known and back, etc. So all these kind of things which are dynamic in a piece or in any time-based observation, they come into the classroom and we discuss them. And because they all major in different fields, from astrophysics to government, they also bring in what's on their mind when they think about their fields.
Ich würde gerne die Frage auf Deutsch stellen, weil ich es besser formuliere. Es gab vorhin eine Trennung zwischen dem Sound und dem Rhythmus. Sie sagten, dass der Klang untersucht werden soll, subjektiv, aber bitte ohne Rhythmus.
Nee, aha, okay.
Ja, ab welcher Stelle kommt sozusagen alles, was Rhythmik und was Form im eigentlichen Sinne ist, sozusagen wieder zurück in die Musik? Das würde mich interessieren.
Okay, I will probably still do it in English, the answer. So the question is, so I asked about composing sounds without rhythm. What I meant is to have this steady beat underneath. So this boom, 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 boom. And what you can do, you go into the archives, you look for Pierre Henry's 10th Symphony composed, I forget the year, but a long time ago, where he took recordings of the nine Beethoven symphonies and mashed it up into a 10th. Beautiful piece, amazing composition. And then he did a remix a couple of years where he just puts the steady beat underneath. And I'm not giving a judgment, just listen to the two and try to figure out all the subtleties he composed into the original version. When you have that steady beat, you don't listen to that anymore. So obviously in what we just heard from Eloy, there's a lot of rhythm in there, and we talk about that, but not a steady beat. So what I'm trying to go away is, don't set up an expectation you will fulfill for the next 30 seconds. There need always to be modulation.
Larissa. Sorry,
when you first introduce the students to this type of music, do you like start slowly so you don't hit them in the face with like the hardcore stuff? And like how do you do that, and how's the reaction from the students?
For years, I started the first listening assignment for a long time was always Stockhausen Gesang der Jünglinge. So that is more kind of in the face, I would say. The reason is because there's a lot of good literature. There's the book with all the sketches, etc. That always leads to an amazing discussion, because that's really kind of an eye-ear opener, but also a shockwave. I have experimented this term to replace that with Jonathan Harvey's Mortus Blanco, which is much more harmonious, still a lot of interesting treatments of the voice, which are totally outside of their comfort zone, and then we go to Stockhausen later. I don't have a good method for it. I think both are valid. So shocking someone in, let's say, good intention, not shocking someone to overwhelm him or her, but shocking someone to really, okay, here's something you have never thought about it. It's not bad. But you have to be prepared also to catch them when they fall.
And like, how do you achieve to not scare them?
Too much scare them. You know, the level of scaredom is much lower nowadays. I mean, everybody has watched all these horror movies, etc. What does this really scare them anymore? I'm not sure that Gesang der Jünglinge is more terrible than a lot of blood.
You described the course, a 3-month course.
Mm-hmm.
How would you continue if you had the same students for the next course?
That's an excellent question. I did that once, many years ago, and we went, obviously, I mean, they had composed the first piece, they went to the knowing of what does it feel if I compose in stereo, but then I have all these speakers and I can do something to it, and we were building on that, and then making a larger piece, etc. We went into much more detail, stuff you can't do in these 3 months. But still, it is very different from when I taught in France for years on the conservatory, where you have students for many years and you kind of build from one semester to the next, to the next, to the next. The only crutch I have here is to say, okay, so there's no follow-up course, you have to come into my grad seminar, and a lot do. So I just take them into my PhD seminar as undergrads.
So, I mean, to follow up on that, what you have been describing is an approach that goes a little bit from kind of storytelling and kind of radio play kind of approach, and trying to take them away to dig deeper into the sonic quality of the sound and such, and building up something. And the question is, I mean, obviously from the example that we've heard, they are not quite there, of course not. And the question comes to what do you do then to get them further away from taking sound as a representative of something else?
Yeah, that is impossible in 3 months, honestly. Yeah. So I guess also my aim is probably, I don't have any illusion that any of those students will ever become a composer of electronic or electroacoustic music. They all use sound in their music. I mean, a lot of them, they either do songs or write to the guitar or make dance music, etc. What I hope in this course to open their ears to other ways of thinking the creative process. And thinking the creative process not from presets or a plugin or from some process they have heard elsewhere, but searching for their own way. And I must say, normally after a student graduated for some years, there's no contact. And then 3-4 years later, that's I don't know, statistically interesting, but 3-4 years later I'm getting suddenly an email from someone saying, oh, I just made this record and do you want to listen? And then I'm listening to it and say, nice. There is something trickled in, something is there. And the other question you asked, we have what we call independent studies. So very frequently a student who has taken this course and wants to continue, they then do kind of a one-on-one with me, and then we just look into their production. So I've taught mastering of a hip-hop production, I mean on a one-on-one. I'm just listening with my ears to what they're doing and trying to figure out how can they do it more personally.
Hans, it was fascinating for me to see how you're dealing with teaching in the States, where the model of education, higher education, is very different from mine, of course, my time teaching in the States. You seem to have taken a sort of a level playing field approach in that you present them with recording technology, quite simple recording technology, and get them recording sound and manipulating that. Of course, with a lot of American students, it would be fair to say you could have taken the programming approach, because a lot of them come in with significant programming experience. Mm-hmm. Why don't you go down the programming route, computer programming?
Mm-hmm. Because, let's say, the other 5 peer institutes do that already.
Okay.
Because that is much easier to teach, I'm sorry. It's so easy to teach technology, because you just click here, you click there, you get that effect, etc., and I'm avoiding any aesthetic discussion. That's super easy. And I'm not interested. Then I would not learn anything. I'm interested in this clash and figuring out what is the next generation thinking. What do they want to do, and why doesn't it work for me? So what is the aesthetic misunderstanding from my end to what they want to do? Or is there probably a possibility of feeding something into their practice which could be helpful?
Are some of them coming to you with requests to do something algorithmically, for instance, or with artificial intelligence?
Yeah. But that is more in my grad seminar. I'm teaching right now an artificial intelligence class, so that is different. Yeah.
What are your 5 institutions that are seen as competitors that do the programming approach? Afterwards?
Afterwards.